Hello, everybody. I think you can hear me now. If you can't, well, I was going to say let me know, but I don't know that you would be able to let me know. But anyway, hi, welcome everybody. So glad that you're here. Thank you to Llewellyn for hosting LlewellynCon. Hello, everybody. I'm seeing lots of great hellos in the chat. So thank you to Llewellyn and LlewellynCon for hosting this. This has been a really interesting, I was going to say a couple of days, it's really been over a week of great little introductions to people's work and getting to hear some really neat stuff about different aspects of sort of magical life, and things like that, which has just been wonderful. So thanks to Llewellyn for that. Thanks, Anna, as well, for kind of running the board here for us, too. I really appreciate that. Also, just as a side note, quick congratulations to a couple of our Llewellyn authors, Mr. Devin Hunter, Mr. Matt Oren, who recently celebrated a wedding. So congrats to both of them as well. So huge congratulations there. If you're joining us here today, I'm assuming that you probably have at least a vague interest in folk magic in North America, right? You're one of those people who, as they say here in Pennsylvania, German country, where I am, enjoy doing more than eating bread, right? So that's what I'm going to talk about here today. So, who am I? Why am I talking about this? For those who don't know me, my name is Cory Thomas Hutcheson. I'm author of this book, New World Witchery, a trove of North American folk magic. I'm also, I've been a host of a podcast for the better part of a decade, actually over a decade, called New World Witchery as well, in which myself and my co-host Lane explore different aspects of North American folk magic and witchcraft as well. Looking at different regional expressions of that. We've interviewed a lot of people. We've done, I think, something over 100 hours of interviews through the show, and even kind of in the background as well. We've done extensive research. This book itself was kind of a monster. It's got something like 20 pages of bibliography, 400 plus footnotes. So lots of research involved with this over the past decade. I myself am a researcher. I kind of approach things academically. I've got a doctorate in American Studies with a specialization in folklore, and I've done my other specialization is ethnography, which basically just means asking people for their stories and then listening to them and trying to write them down or record them in some way. So yeah, that's kind of who I am and where I'm coming from. But the book is not just kind of a dry academic tome. It also looks at kind of the practical stuff that goes into folk magic as well. So there's things like how do you develop your own, what's called a commonplace book, a place where you sort of keep all of your information, including magical information. There's also things like, how do you make a recipe for Four Thieves vinegar? How do you create a calendar cycle that's based on kind of folk traditions and the region that you're in, things like that. So lots of stuff going on there. Hopefully that's going to be something that you're interested in. What I'm going to do today is run us through kind of a whirlwind tour of North American folk magic, talking about a lot of different aspects of it. And I'm kind of following what I've done with the book, which is to organize this in a group of 13 rites. So I'm just going to kind of give a brief, dip in the pool in each of the sort of quote unquote rites to talk about kind of different aspects of North American folk magic that you might be interested in, and things that you might be interested in exploring further kind of down the line. So I guess let's get started. Let's go on to the first slide here. The first rite I have us kind of get into is what's called naming. And the idea here is we have to figure out what we're talking about, because when somebody says the word witch, that means something different to a lot of people. For a lot of us who are here in this presentation, this chat room, it's going to mean something that probably has maybe even some really positive connotations. But for a lot of people, historically, it didn't, right? It was something that had some very negative labels attached to it. I've got, for example, here, I've got Glinda from The Wizard of Oz asking, are you a good witch or a bad witch? So that question would have been very complicated and difficult to answer depending on who you talk to and when you talk to them in North American history. For a lot of people, the term witch would have been pretty negative, but the terms are slippery, because if you ask somebody if they're what's called a water witch in Appalachia, they're going to potentially have a very positive opinion of that, because that just means that you're a dowser. It means that you're somebody who can help them find water or wells on their land, right? Similarly, there are terms that get substituted in for being a witch. So being a cunning person, something we hear in parts of New England early on, and that has some positive connotations. There also are things like yarb doctors or fairy doctors in parts of the mountains of the south that are practicing folk magic. Is it what we would call witchcraft? That's, again, it's a little slippery, but there are lots of these traditions that are kind of circulating around. Um, and so what I'm going to do is I kind of explore this and take the term witch. I look at, for example, Ronald Hutton's work. He's a scholar who's done a lot of research on this, and he has 4 different definitions of witch. And I kind of boiled down what I'm looking at, and I'm basically talking about people who can do both positive and negative magic. They can use magic for both benefit and harm, although they may not use it for harm. They at least know how that works, right? Mostly because then they can undo it if somebody else does it. And then they also have some kind of interaction with the spirit world. They're doing some kind of communication with either the dead or with unseen spirits, things like that. That becomes a part of their practice. So those 2 things kind of have to go together when I'm looking at what I'm calling witchery, a type of sort of folk witchcraft that leans into sort of the witchy side of things. All right. So then in the next rite, we get into initiation. This has to do with how does a person become a witch, right? And there's a lot of different ways that this happens in North American folklore. I've got some things up here on the screen that have to do with different methods for somebody who chooses to become a witch, which is absolutely one way that you could go. So, for example, there's this ritual called killing the moon, which appears in some of the Appalachian folklore collections, where somebody will go out and use a silver bullet or just a regular bullet or even just a stone. And they'll go to a hilltop on a full moon night, and they'll shoot or throw a stone or do whatever to the moon. And they'll do this for a certain number of times, usually 9 or 13 times. And eventually what they're hoping to see is that the moon will kind of turn red, or what they're saying is it'll bleed. And once that has happened, they have been accepted as a witch. They've been initiated into witchcraft. Of course, there's a lot of other methods too. There's the passing of power. This is pretty common in folk traditions, where somebody has, say, for example, in some Pennsylvania German healing traditions, such as Bracherei, there's the idea that you have to pass the power on to somebody else before you die, or the power is gone, right? It has to be transferred from one person to the next person. Whether that's by laying your hand on somebody and intentionally passing the power, or by teaching them secret words. Those are different things that you do. So this is really, really crucial, that you have to pass this power on and initiate it. But you can also just be born a witch in some of the North American folklore and folk tales too. So, for example, if you're born with what's called a caul or a veil, which is just basically the amniotic sac around your head, you're supposedly going to have psychic abilities. That's a way that you might be marked as somebody who's going to have some of these gifts. Being born the 7th son of a 7th son is also a really common one. It can also be 7th daughter of a 7th daughter. There's one tradition that says if you're born on Christmas and you're named Mary, that's going to inherently give you a little boost, magically speaking. And I've encountered people who actually have who fit this tradition. So, for example, the 7th son of a 7th son, both my brother-in-law and my podcasting partner Lane have people in their families. In one case it's a grandfather, in one case it's a great-grandfather, who were 7th sons of 7th sons, and they had the ability to get rid of warts. So they could buy warts off of you. They would give you a shiny penny if you had warts, and then you were supposed to go spend the penny, and the penny, as soon as you spent it, your warts would start to go away. So some of that comes down to this idea of being sort of chosen by your birth order, by something at your birth. You might be birthmarked as well, and sometimes you make the choice yourself to become a witch. Yeah. Oh, I see somebody who was born on call. That's wonderful. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and the calls themselves actually are powerful magical tools. We see sailors using them as anti-drowning charms during the sort of big navigation, shipbuilding, exploration period in North American history. All right, so for rite number 3, then, we have to ask the question, what do witches do? Well, they cast spells, right? We hear witches, we think witches casting spells, whether that's, cackling over a bubbling cauldron, right? Waving a magic wand. But in North America, a lot of the magic that people are doing, oh no, we lost the feed. That's all right though. So in North America, a lot of what people are doing, they're trying to figure out, they're trying to do one of two different kinds of, that's okay, Anna, that's fine. They're trying to do um, either beneficial magic or baneful magic, right? So they're doing the sweet side of things, which in the slide you saw that somebody she was holding a honey jar, right? Or on the sour side of things, they might have been doing what's called a vinegar jar, right? And those are kind of more modern iterations of some older spells that we've seen out there. Um, and a lot of this had to do with reacting to magic that was already out there that you were counteracting, right? So just because you were doing something that might be considered sort of baneful magic didn't necessarily mean that you were, you were doing evil, right? So in some cases, it was you were fighting back against evil that was being done to you. So, for example, um, just a bit of trivia question: which of these was a colonial era method for detecting and punishing a witch? Was it A, boiling a bottle of urine with a bunch of pins inside from somebody that was cursed? B, baking urine into a loaf of bread and feeding it to a dog? Or C, pouring cream that wouldn't turn into butter onto a fire and beating it with a poker? Curious if anybody has an answer for that one. A, B, C, or any guesses? It's actually D, all of the above. All of those are there come the responses. Yeah, all of those are different ways that people responded to witchcraft, right? So I know it was a trick question. That was not fair of me. But yeah, they would do these different spells. But that's the thing, is that everybody is doing magic in all of these different methods. Um, these are different forms of magic that people are doing. These are magics that everyday people are doing, right? So everyday people are performing these sort of magic rites, these magic spells as a part of their life, trying to deal with things that are kind of going on in the world around them. So that's kind of the answer to what witches do. They do magic, right? But the thing is, everybody's doing magic. So does that make everybody a witch? That's kind of a useful question. If everybody's out there doing a spell, whether that's a baneful spell or a beneficial spell, and I should note, there's a lot of people doing very beneficial spells, so they'll be doing things like healing work as well, right? They'll be doing things, love spells. There's terminology in some practices. So, for example, in forms of hoodoo, there are people who are called lady-hearted workers, and there's some gender essentialism in that terminology, obviously. But the idea is that those are folks who will do love magic and healing magic. They might do divination or even luck or treasure finding magic, but they're going to stay away from the stuff that would be baneful or harmful to other people. So there are people who draw boundaries around the kinds of magic that they're going to do. But in the end, everybody's doing some kind of magic. All right. So then the next thing, the next rite that people enact is what I call second sight. And this is the idea that you're in communication with the spirit world, right? It's not just psychic gifts necessarily, although those do play a big part. The idea is that you have some way to communicate with the other world and receive messages from it, receive guidance from it. There were people who, for example, North America, that would communicate with angels. There are people that would communicate with the dead. There were people that communicate with they would call devils or sort of unsavory spirits, right? There are people that would communicate with fairies, among other things. Sorry if I'm banging my microphone here. So there are lots of different spirits that you can interact with. There are lots of different ways that you can do it too. So, for example, in Salem, one of the reported things that sort of set the whole thing off was in the Paris household, the young women who lived there were playing with something called a Venus glass. And the I agree, pineapple does belong in pizzas. Of course, everybody flees the chat immediately after I say that, right? But the Venus glass was basically a fortune telling method to figure out who somebody's future husband was going to be by cracking an egg into a glass of water. That's a method that's used in a lot of different practices. So, for example, if you know anything about curanderismo, they have a cleansing rite called Olympia, where they will use an egg and then crack it into a glass of water as well. In that case, they're not necessarily looking for future husbands, but they're looking for spirit attachments or things that might be holding you back or causing you problems, right? So lots of different kind of methods for doing this. And this is, it's not just somebody, spending the time to go sit down and read tarot cards or something like that, or read playing cards, which is the thing I really like. It's also stuff, these little almost games that people play. So the Venus glass was kind of a game that they were playing. They also held what were called, at the time, they were called dumb suppers or silent suppers. The idea being that you would prepare a meal completely in silence and leave an extra setting at the table. And that eventually a spirit would show up, and that would be the spirit of somebody's future husband, or you would see the reflection of the spirit in the empty plate at the table. There's actually one really, really interesting story about that, where the spirit shows up and he's, looks really haggard and doesn't look like he's very happy. And so the people who are holding the supper sort of blow out the candle and everything kind of, goes back to normal. Later on, the young woman who saw this future husband marries him, and she's, riding in a carriage, as you do with him. And and she tells him the story of like, I met you before. I did this dumb supper, this silent supper, and you showed up, and all. It was such an interesting thing. I don't know that I, would have believed it before that. And suddenly the guy goes ghostly pale, and gets furious, and looks at her and says, "It was you, you witch! That night you dragged me through hell." And then I think he kills her at that point in the story. So not a happy ending for anybody, but this is something that was very widely known, very widely understood. And it influenced a lot of things. So this also involved things like treasure hunting, being able to do divination for treasure hunting, had a huge influence on one of the major religious groups that formed in North America, which was the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. Joseph Smith's family were engaged in magical treasure hunting, and they would do divinatory rituals to try to find hidden treasures that were under the earth, or make them come to the surface as well. And some of the things that were involved with that later became part of his the sort of the background for how he found the golden plates that were part of the sort of founding story of the Mormon Church. So, Rhiannon, you're asking about, is a dumb supper the same as a setting a place for ancestor veneration? Just the short answer is they're related, but they're slightly different. So the way that it's practiced a lot of times in sort of history and folklore, it's very divinatory, whereas the sort of more contemporary update of it is to do it so that your ancestors come to the table with you. So it's still doing the same thing. It's just the sort of end goal is a little different between those two. All right, so then the next thing that people think about witches doing is flight. And so, if you hear stories about witches, right, you hear like, oh, the witch is flying around at night on her broomstick, right? And broomsticks, they're a part of the lore, but realistically, there are lots of ways to fly if you're a witch. There's lots of stories about witches flying around on lots of farm animals. So horses, if you went to the barn in the morning and your horse was really lathered up in his sweat and had braids in its hair or in its mane, it had been ridden by a witch the night before, knots in its mane, things like that too. The comic is actually based on a story I really love, which is the story of Betty Booker, who was shortchanged by this skipper. She was a witch in Maine, and she was shortchanged by this skipper who wouldn't sell her some fish, and so she cursed him, so he didn't get any fish that day. And then that night, she showed up at his house and put this thing called a witch's bridle on him, which is this thing she slipped into his mouth, and it turned him into sort of a human horse, not quite a centaur, but like made him ride around all over Maine, all over the countryside. And then the next morning kind of left him, almost dead in his bed, and said, maybe next time you'll be a little nicer to an old lady who's asking for some fish, right? So that's a story that I really love. But they would, witches flying around. It doesn't necessarily, it's interesting because sometimes it's very literal. Sometimes people seem to see these as very literal things that witches are doing. And sometimes it's very metaphorical. So there's lots of stories about witches sort of sending their spirit out, and their bodies will sort of lie on the floor or lie in bed in the house while their spirit is out in the form of a hare or a deer or something like that. kind of wandering around, and anything you do to the spirit would then affect the body. So there's lots of stories. For example, there's stories of like witches going out as hares or black cats, and then getting their paws cut or shot in these stories by people who suspected that they were witches. And then the next day, the person would actually have an injured arm or an injured hand as well. Um, so flight can mean a lot of different things, and one of the things I really enjoy, and something I explore kind of in the book that I would really love. You don't even have to read the book to get this. If you just Google Kay Turner, Kayturner, AFS presidential address, I think it was 2017. It's this amazing speech the former president of the American Folklore Society gave about why witches go out flying at night. And it has to do with the idea of being liberated from an oppressive relationship. And getting away from somebody who is trying to control you and dominate you, and going and expressing yourself in this kind of wild, untamed way. It's absolutely wonderful. So I highly recommend people check that out. I also mentioned it in the book, so if you have the book, you can find the reference to that. All right, so the next thing that witches do, right, number 6, is what I call chewing the root. This has to do with gathering the magical ingredients, right? If you're going to have your sorceress pot, your cauldron bubbling away over the fire, you got to put stuff in it, right? And oftentimes this had to do with, getting your hands a little dirty. You'd have to either grow the things yourself, gather them from the wild, or in more contemporary times, you can actually go to the grocery store, right? And it's really worth noting that in North American folk magic, most of our ingredients are not these super exotic ingredients that are imported from all over the world. They're actually stuff that you find everywhere, right? They're lemons that you can go buy at the grocery store. They're wild herbs that are kind of growing out. Milkweed is blossoming where I am right now, or Artemisia is growing, or mugwort I should say, is growing kind of rampantly everywhere. And these are the kinds of things people would go out and gather really, really readily. And they would use kind of what was available in the landscape around them. And it was really important that they were pulling this stuff in from their immediate vicinity, because most of the time people who are practicing folk magic, they don't have a lot of resources, right? The reason they're turning to folk magic is because they don't have, tons of money to go out and, buy, exotic perfumes from overseas or things like that. They're having to use this stuff that is immediately available to them. So that's why you see in folk magic a lot of things that are really, really common: butter, sugar, cream. There's dirt is a huge one, right? So going out and gathering dirt from different places. Graveyard dirt is probably the best known, but people are gathering dirt from places like hospitals or schools. Church, just the churchyard itself can be a place that you gather dirt from, and you use that dirt to sort of cast your spell as well. So that's a big part of it. There's also a lot of crafting, literally, in folk magic and witchcraft, where people are making the supplies that they use, right? They're making the poppets or the dolls. And oftentimes those are made out of really simple things. There's ragdoll poppets that we found. There are corn husk dollies that are really, really common. And there's rules about them. So, for example, if you're in the place where I am, which is kind of Amish country, you're not going to put a face on your doll, right? Because if you put a face on your doll, it's a sort of a blasphemous thing. Now, that being said, if you do put a face on your doll, then that allows you to give it extra magical oomph, right? So you're kind of breaking the rule about how you make these dolls, so that you can then put somebody into that doll, so that you can do whatever workings you need to do on them. All right. So the next thing, and this is the one that I think everybody loves, is having a familiar, right? A familiar spirit. There's all kinds of familiar spirits out there. Animals play a really big role in North American folk magic. So transformation into animals, as I mentioned earlier, when witches are out flying, oftentimes they're transforming into things like hares or cats or deer, things like that. Those are really, really common. And then, there's also a lot of use of, and this is something that people get a little touchy about, but I get it, animal parts. So animal parts play a big part in North American folk magic. So, for example, does anybody know, if I say the term baculum, does anybody know what that means? I know there's going to be a few of you who do. I mean, where would you find a baculum? Let's see if the Ralph knows. Flurkin falls under miscellaneous. I like that. That's true. Yes. Okay, Kitty. Yes. Very good. A raccoon penis bone. Very good. Popular as a gambling charm in certain types of practices. So this is the kind of thing, yeah, get it from a taxidermist, right? But this is something that that you can find in different types of magical practices. These bones are used, and it's not always. People kind of freak out when you talk about baculums or gator paws and stuff like that. Rabbit's feet are a really common one, but there are ways that you can work with these that are a little more ethical. So, for example, in my own practice, I have a rabbit's foot, a lucky rabbit's foot charm that I collected from a rabbit that had been hit in the road. It was a roadkill animal, and I saw it and I immediately knew, like, this thing didn't have a fair shot in life. So I took it and I gave it a funeral, I gave it a burial, I did ritual prayers to sort of send it off on its way. It was already dead, and I collected its foot and gave it a replacement foot that I made for it. And then I mummified the foot and I used that, and it's actually this really interesting thing because it sort of has this permanent spirit connection to the rabbit now, and so the rabbit sort of becomes something that I, as much as people who listen to the podcast know that I'm slightly fearful of bunnies because of Watership Down as a child. They're also a really useful tool, or the bunny foot, the rabbit foot is a really useful tool for opening up pathways for me and things like that. Okay, the next rite, I'm going to try and speed through some of these because I know we're going to be running low on time here soon, is what I call hallowing the ground. And this has to do with connecting with your local landscape, the local stories that are around you. So, for example, we've got Bigfoot here wandering along the road. Bigfoot plays a big role in, he's a cryptid, right? He's this sort of legendary creature. But finding those legendary creatures in your neighborhood, in your sort of space, right? Whatever region you're from, you're going to have variations on these stories. So, for example, somebody who has a Bigfoot type creature in Florida is probably going to be talking about something called a skunk ape, right? Whereas if you're out in Utah, there's a lot of legends in that area, Mormon legends that talk about Bigfoot as basically being Cain from the Bible, still wandering the earth, and he's just gotten really shaggy and hairy here. So there's lots of different varying stories about this. But it's important to find the stories that have to do with your own sort of regionality. So kind of close to where I am, we have, for example, the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil is this sort of cryptid creature that becomes very representative of this particular space around sort of the New Jersey, Delaware County area. The Pine Barrens really is where it's representative of. So you have creatures like that, but it can also be just the regional creatures that are, or the regional landscape that you're in. So it's paying attention to kind of what do your seasons look like? What do your, what birds come out at what time? So I'm oftentimes paying a lot of attention to when do the cardinals come out at the end of winter, because that tells me that winter is almost over, right? And being kind of in tune with that space that you're on and around. And protecting your space as well. It has to do with your home and making that connection with your home. So, for example, there's a practice where this is a hoodoo practice where people will do what's called nailing down the home, where you use an increasingly large, increasing sizes of nails, so very small nails to start with, and finishing with railroad spikes, and you nail down the four corners of each room in your house, then the four corners of your house, and then the four corners of your property to hold your land, so that you won't be kicked off of it, right? And so that it's protected as well. The next rite is called what I call calling the moon. This has to do with finding your own regional cycles, your own regional variations on holidays. Oftentimes when we're practicing contemporary folk magic and witchcraft, we get caught up in this idea of the wheel of the year, and it's a perfectly valid thing to do. I have no problems with people following the wheel of the year. We just had Midsummer or Letha, right? So this is perfectly fine. But it's also worth digging into kind of what actually goes on around you. What are the seasonal festivals that you actually have in your area? I did a lot of my doctoral research on, for example, a Krampus parade that happens in Philadelphia that just now become what's called the Parade of Spirits, and features a whole host of different spirits, right? For those who don't know, Krampus is this sort of Yuletide figure of menace and fear, right? Who shows up to punish the naughty children and collect them in a sack. Um, and so that became something that I pay a lot of attention to. So I have this whole cycle of stuff that happens around the Yuletide season that ties into the story of Krampus. Um, Similarly, you might find that Groundhog Day, where I am in Pennsylvania, Groundhog Day is actually important because groundhogs, the Grunzau, Ralph would know this. Grunzau is our predictor of the end of winter, right? This is if you've ever seen Groundhog Day, people holding up Punxsutawney Phil, right, to tell you when does winter end, right? But that's not going to be the same tradition everywhere. So, for example, that comes from a tradition in Europe where they would watch what's called the Candlemas Bear, predicting the winter. The next rite is working the charm. This has to do with the idea of written charms. Weirdly, in North America, there was a fairly high rate of literacy throughout most of the colonial period and moving into contemporary times. It's not to say that it was universal or widespread, but a lot of people did have books in their homes. And the books that you had could indicate a lot about the kind of magic you did. So if you had, for example, these famous books called like the 6th and 7th books of Moses, right? Those are books that automatically made you very suspect of being a magical practitioner or a witch, because they were often associated with magic. There are also written charms that people would carry around. So for example, there's a Himmelsbrief, which is a heaven letter. If you ever, I don't know how many of you remember getting these letters in the mail that said, if you just mail this, make copies of this letter, 5 copies of this letter, mail it to 5 friends, you'll have so much luck, right? But if you don't, then your dog will turn into a dragon and eat your children or something like that. That kind of a letter is derived from these letters that were called Himmelsbriefen, that were circulated as ways to protect your home from fire or lightning or storms. They could be carried by soldiers to protect them from harm in war and things like that. And they were letters that were supposedly sent down from heaven and had all these kind of really interesting, prescriptions in them saying like you have to carry this letter all times with you to protect you, that you maybe would make copies of these letters and distribute them to other people as well. So yeah, these chain letters, right, that, believe it or not, chain letters derive from an actual magical practice. So that weird email your uncle sends you that says forward this on to 27 people you know for good luck, that has a magical precedent, right? It has a pedigree of magic that you can trace back in history. The next rite is necromancy. This is the working with the dead, right? Which sounds, kind of badass, but it's also it also really has to do with having a relationship with those who passed on. That can literally just be ancestor connections, ancestor veneration. It can be working with the spirits of deceased animals as well. Working with bones is a way of doing that too. But there's also a lot of kind of like really interesting stories about like working with literal corpses. Corpses have this interesting magic. You could actually give your warts to a corpse to have them take it with you, or you could use the corpse to help you find out who a murderer was by putting things in its hands, and it would sort of draw the murderer back to the place where the murder had happened. You also have witches who kind of linger on as sort of vengeful spirits. So one of the best knowns of this would be the Bell Witch, for those who know Tennessee folklore. She supposedly was this. She wasn't really a witch; she was more of a ghost than anything else. But it's the only recorded case of death by haunting in North American history. So yeah, you have these kind of vengeful witches and things like that as well. And then the 12th rite is invisibility. And this is the fact that so much folk magic is actually hidden in plain sight. It's all right in front of us, things that we do all the time, every day. So, for example, if you've ever played those sleepover games like Light as a Feather, Stiff as a Board, right? Or more contemporarily, we have people who are playing Charlie Charlie, where they're spinning pencils and trying to get yes or no answers. If you played Mansion Alley Shack House, you made those little like fortune tellers. If you grew up where you twisted an apple stem or flipped a pop top tab to try to figure out the initial of the person that you were going to date or something like that, those are all really common forms of folk magic, or that have roots in folk magic as well, right? It's all magic that's hidden in plain sight. You can walk into somebody's house and they're probably going to have 5 or 6 different things that all have this slightly folk magical quality to them, and you wouldn't necessarily notice them. Maybe they have a broom behind their door, which if the broom's turned upside down, they don't want you to stay very long because they're trying to get you to leave the house as soon as possible, right? Or if somebody's got, love me not, the flower petals thing, right? Twisting the apple stem, as somebody's saying, to predict things. People have all of these different things that they do. Maybe you pick up a penny, right? If you see a penny in the street, maybe you pick it up. If it's heads up, for good luck, right? If it's tails up, maybe you pick it up, but give it to someone else to pass on, right? Finding a 4-leaf clover. It's all stuff that's very, very common, but it's also kind of hidden so that people don't necessarily associate it with anything negative or witchcraft oriented. And then we get to what I sort of think of as the 13th rite, which is the mystery of it all, right? What comes next? What's going to happen? What do we think about kind of in the aftermath of all this? What do we do with folk magic? How do we find more of it? And that comes down to the question of talking to the people that are burying these traditions. Because if we don't ask for their stories, if we don't ask for their ideas, if we don't learn about their folk magic, then what's going to happen to it? Goes away, right? And people, and this is the problem, is because people are sharing in the chat so many great pieces of folk tradition, but we all know them, right? We all know these things that are popping up in the chat, but if nobody's writing them down, if nobody's recording them, they disappear, right? They go away. So just taking the time to sit down and talk to people. And oftentimes you don't have to say so tell me about your folk magic traditions, because you're going to have, your grandmother's gonna be like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? But if you say, hey, what did you do when you got married to make sure that you were going to have good luck on your wedding day? She's going to open up. She's going to have stuff to talk about, right? So it's finding these important, crucial, pivotal key moments in people's lives and asking questions about them. And then taking the time to write that down, record that. That becomes your way of crafting your own folk tradition. You don't have to go and raid somebody else's cultural traditions to get your own folk magic traditions. You probably have a ton of them already in your life. So it's just a question of you exploring those connections for yourself and finding what the folk magic that is in your world already is as well. So, this is the thing, Terry. You mentioned your uncle doing this fortune telling, and you didn't have a chance to pay attention, but you still remember him doing this with the flowers. So you should totally write that down and then explore that and see if somebody else, compare notes with other people, because maybe somebody does remember a tradition like that. And maybe it would connect up, right? Maybe it would help you remember that practice a little better. And it would be something that you could build on, right? And that's the kind of thing we really want to see. I would love to see people. I would love for this book to be the jumping off point for 1,000 books of people's individual folk practices and traditions that they are building and they are finding in their own world and their own family. So we can go to the last slide. This basically just has ways that you can get in touch with me and everything like that. If you're interested in knowing more, I'm on Instagram as @NewWorldWitchery. Twitter, I'm on there as at NW Witchery or @CTS Luna. And then if you go to newworldwitchery.com, you can find tons of stuff. We've got over 200 articles on folk magic. We've got over 200 episodes of a podcast on folk magic called New World Witchery. Tons and tons of stuff if you're interested. So I think that'll about do it for us. I know we're over time, but if it's possible, I'd love to maybe take just 2 minutes of questions if people have ones that they want to throw out for us. Raina, you're asking, is MSC Mystic South, right? If that's the case, then yes, I will be at Mystic South. I'm actually there twice, once presenting with Lane and once presenting on my own. So let's see. Oh, thank you. That's very sweet, Megan. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Ralph. Appreciate that. So I'm going to scroll really quickly. So I thought I saw one chatting with your Danish mother about traditions. That's wonderful. Please do, talk to your parents, talk to your family members if you can. I know that can be awkward for some people, so don't feel like you need to, do that if it's going to cause agony and angst for you. But you probably have friends as well, friends who have folk traditions that are similar to that they could maybe share some things too. Oh, the bread and butter pole splitting. That's for sure. Yeah. Okay, Ralph, Mummers Day parade question. Complicated history. Love it as a concept. Love it as a sense of like marking the tide turning of the year, because it's basically a New Year's Day parade. Love that. Love the idea of guising. I love the idea of guising. I love the idea of putting on costumes and all that kind of stuff. And then that's great. There definitely is some stuff that they do at the Mummers Parade that I would say maybe as a society we are starting to move past. So it would be good to maybe revisit that and think about like, well, how do we need to evolve a little bit? Let's see. How did I get interested in folklore? I have been interested in folklore since I was a wee tiny baby. I was always interested in like anything that had this like weird sort of magical quality to it. I was the kind of kid who would stare at the clouds and like will them to move in certain ways, and then I would find like rhymes and stuff like that in children's nursery rhymes, and it'd sort of be like, what does this really mean? And sort of I was very much kind of the kid who would read the encyclopedia for fun, so I was always kind of curious about stuff. So American history's impact on folk magic. Probably very roundabout kind of mentioned that, but get into it a lot more in the book and in the podcast as well. So cultural anthropology is very deeply connected to folklore, Brianna. So yes, if you're interested in folk, I'm sorry, that wasn't Brianna, that was Heidi. So if you're interested in pursuing folklore studies and it's not immediately available to you, cultural anthropology is a really good way to go, particularly if you can get into geographic cultural anthropology, where they will basically look at cultural anthropology rooted in specific regions, and they're looking for kind of living traditions. So Tess, yes. I mean, you say your family's devout Christian, you have curanderas in the older generation. There's a lot of people who practice forms of Christianity that are also practicing forms of folk magic. Those two things are not mutually exclusive at all, even though they may not like you calling it folk magic, right? They're doing stuff that is magical. Safety, taking things from nature or abandoned places. Do be careful, particularly following the laws in your region, because there are places where like collecting graveyard dirt would be illegal, but there are also ways that you can kind of work around that. So for example, if you join, and this is a great thing to do, and something I've done before, where you can join cemetery cleanup volunteer groups, where you will help restore and clean historic cemeteries and things like that. And in part of that, you'll oftentimes kind of be planting flowers and things like that. And you can, have a little bit of dirt that you wind up collecting from the cemetery in that process. That's not anything anybody's going to bat an eye at, because you're also helping to take care of that space and then building a relationship with the dead, for sure. Am I the pyramid with the top hat? You'll have to shake my hand to know for sure, right? Good. Okay. Well, I think that kind of gets us. If I missed anybody's question, I'm so sorry. If you have more questions, please come find me on social media or through the website. We've got contact me forms and things like that. I'm always happy to try to field questions from folks. If you have questions, I'd love to point you in the direction of additional resources and things like that too. So, well, glad everybody had a good time. Thank you so much. And have a wonderful rest of LlewellynCon. Stick around. I think we've got another presentation coming up in like an hour and 15 minutes, something like that. So, hope you enjoy that, and have a wonderful day, everybody.